Okay, well, welcome along, everybody. And what we're looking at today, aspects of Brighton's educational history. So we're not going to cover every single school in the city, and we're going to work our way through in a timeline. There's some important things to start. Any old boys in the room? Right. Now, this might be difficult. Any Vardinians in the room? Oh, okay. Look, we better get this over and done with. Okay. This is the only picture you're going to see of Vardine. Okay, so we've got to move on swiftly from there. It gets founded down in York Place, comes Pelham Street Schools, and eventually moves out in the interwar period out to rural surrounds, but that's the end of that. Okay, so sorry, Vardine people, that's the end. Okay, so, right. Schools in Brighton, and really until the end of the 1770s, Brighton is just enclosed mostly within, you know, the very excitingly named West Street, East Street, North Street, and the beach. A few outlying buildings, but all the education is going to take place within the area of the old town, generally called the Lanes. And there's a variety of ways of getting education. I mean, there's no compulsory education until the 1871 Act. So this is charity schools, or what we call dame schools. Dame schools didn't necessarily run by women, but it's a very, very rudimentary education. But we don't exactly know where the charity school for boys was in Black Lion Street, but this is in the 1930s, Black Lion Street running down from the Lanes to the seafront. So we're looking northwards along it, so somewhere along there, and none of the early maps or documents give you an indication exactly where it was, but we're a bit better off because it gets absorbed into Springett schools in Meeting House Lane, so a little bit further north in the city. And there's a rather nice period map here, and there sometimes these things don't work on one of these screens, but excuse me. Here's the Free School, here's Black Lion Street running. That's a thatch house inn that we were looking at just now. And we're going up to the Free School there, okay? So Meeting House Lane running through there. And that gets absorbed into William and Auntie Springett School. And very roughly, where that Jewellers is, this could be anywhere in the Lanes, which consists of nothing these days, but Jewellers. So there's the Meeting House. Now, a lot of people, when they think Meeting House Lane, it obviously goes to the Quaker Meeting House. But in fact, there were two meeting houses in Meeting House Lane, and this is the one it's named after, which until the 1980s was the Elim Foursquare Gospel Tabernacle. Only in Brighton would it close down and become a pub called the Font. The Font and Firkin originally, but now it's the Font Pub. But as far as I can tell, looking at that previous map from 1788, the Jewellers on the right-hand side is the charity school, that like Springett's. That's William and Anthony Springett School. So we're still expanding out from the Lanes because right at the end of the 1770s, the businesses which were in the town centre that use up a lot of space, so builders' yards, stables, workshops, are then popping out northwards across North Street into what becomes the North Lane we know today, but would have been into the toffs and crofts of the town, as it was called, around Bond Street area, New Road, and then ever further north over into North Lane. But at this period, everything is just taking place within the confines of the old town. Okay, we've got Grimmett's Charity School here. This is a lovely pre-1860s view of Duke Street. We're looking up Duke Street. That's the building in the middle there, which becomes the Fabrica Gallery, Holy Trinity Church, which then becomes these days Fabrica Gallery. And at one time, that was destined to be Brighton's local history museum. It had been bought when it closed down as Holy Trinity Church. And an advert went out for a keeper of the museum. And I thought, well, I like local history. I applied. So I get to a job, meet the director of the Royal Pavilion in the big dome of the Royal Pavilion for the job interview. And I thought I did reasonably well at the interview. I thought, yes. Came out, and sitting on the sofa in his office was a man with a beard and a brown corduroy suit, and he had museum keeper written across his head. I looked at myself. I looked like a Brighton used car dealer, shiny suit. Yeah. And John Rolls got the job. we stayed very good friends after. But it didn't become the History Museum, sadly. But on the left-hand side of the church, there's a load of cottages running away up there. They get demolished for road widening in the 1850s. But Greenwich Charity School was right at the top of the street. It was here, the free school up here. So it really opposite that, what used to be the Havana cocktail bar up there. Okay, now the first school really established that people would go to as a proper charity school with wider surrounds was in Middle Street, which you may have heard they're going to close Middle Street School because the numbers using it have dropped alarmingly. But Middle Street was established under the Edward Gough bequests. £400, considerable sum of money in 1805, and still operating. That building was demolished in the early 1970s, and the modern school was there. And I gave a talk on local history a couple of years ago to Middle Street School, and it was very, very central Brighton, because when you looked at the kids in the room, they all said, my father must be a poet, a writer, an actor. You know, they all had that look about them, that Brighton look about them. But sadly, that's going to go. But this was the rather nice. It was one of the founding members of it was John Nelson Galty. And John Nelson Galty was first cousin of Admiral Lord Nelson, came from the same village in Norfolk. And he was a nonconformist minister who was, for about 30 years, was a minister at the Elim Foursquare Gospel Tabernacle that we saw earlier on. Okay, this is rather nice. Some of you may know that you know the Hannington's Lane's been there about 8 or 9 years now. The new addition of you won't often hear me say this about Brighton planning authorities, but a very welcome new addition to the city is Hannington Lane. And when they opened it up, they had to take down the old Timpson shop in North Street, which ironically was the oldest shop in North Street, but it gave access in, and it revealed Puget School. Now, a lot of the early histories always call it Puget Sunday School, but there's no evidence it ever was a Sunday school. It was another form of charity school. But if you go into Hannington Lane, from North Street, that's the lovely Flint building there on the left, is that Puget School. Okay, now, this is rather, we all know, the most Brighton of Brighton shops, vegetarian shoes down in North Lane. But this starts out as the wonderfully named Mr. Swan Downer, who says, at his obituary, he said, you know, a renowned Protestant son of Brighton, you know, emphasising that, made a lot of money in the city of London, came back to Brighton, and when he died, 1820, he dies, but he left a considerable sum of money. Look, £12,100 in the 1820s. So set up a school for poor girls, which was absolutely revolutionary at the time. And this was the building down here. On a good day, and with the eye of faith, if you squeeze your back against the Comedia windows, you can just read above vegetarian shoes, you could just see it says Swan Downer's Charity School, but you need the light in the right direction to get that. They're there for some considerable time until they outgrew that, and then they moved to Dyke Road, to the building which, whenever I do tours in Brighton, people are convinced it's a church. It's got that Gothic revival look. But Swan Downer's Charity School, it's there until 1944, when they had one pupil left, and the one pupil gets moved to a local school. It gets sold off, and it was an auction room for a long time, and then I'm sure boys at the school will remember it being Sloopy's Discotheque back in the 60s, and there's been a succession of rather dodgy nightclubs, and now it's, I think it's a cocktail bar and fringe venue, but it's a really, really interesting architectural building. One of the most famous schools, and the great sad loss to the town, was down here at the corner of Church Street and New Road. The building on the left-hand side is still there. It's a rather nice Italian cafe these days, the old Regent Hotel. But opposite was the National School, where my dad grew up in Bond Street. My grandparents were Mead & Co, Brighton's premier removers and auctioneers. My dad grew up in Bond Street, and that was his school. Didn't go very often, but that was his nearby school, and you know, scandalously demolished in the 70s. But the most beautiful school, very well known. There was a junior version of it, the infant school, which came a bit later. It's still there. It's in Upper Gardner Street. If you go along Upper Gardner Street, which is operating this morning as the market, it's on the west side as you go past the Hart pub. Okay, now this is often referred to as the girls' grammar school, of course, the old high school. Now, founded as Ellen Williams' private house or school for young ladies in what had been Thomas Reed Kemp's, one of his many properties. One of the reasons he went spectacularly broke was that he had property all around Sussex, Arundel, Hurstmonceux Castle, and obviously in Brighton. But by the late 1820s, he'd gone completely bust, and like all bust millionaires, he fled in penniless to Paris, and they seemed to have a rather nice life in Paris, as a penniless millionaire for many years after. He did come back to Brighton at the end of his life, but that was his house, and goes on to be the Girls' Day School Trust, and of course it's still there today as the renamed Brighton Girls. Whole raft of 1850s, Brighton rapidly growing. Almost every 10 census years, from 1810 onwards, it almost doubles in population every 10 years. And certainly between 1811 and 1821 is 103% population growth. And then the next 10 years it's a 70% population growth. So it's a booming community. Of course, the bulk of that population coming in aren't going to be going to schools. They're service personnel, to cater for the needs of the further up the economic chain. But these are all from 1858, as you can see. So just look at the addresses. Grenville Place, which some of you may remember with the Istanbul Cafe, they were ill repute around in Grenville Place. It's now under the front bit of Churchill Square. Guildford Road up by the station, Wickham Terrace opposite the charity school, and Clifton Road. All of these addresses, of course, are Brighton's smart West End. They're up and west. And see, I'm really a geography teacher, though I haven't got corduroy trousers on or a tweed jacket. I do have them at home. I'm not allowed to wear them out. But this is standard British cities have a west end and an east end. Fresh air's coming out of the Atlantic. It's blowing eastward, and smoke smells and smuts get blown eastward. You've got money, you live up west in most British cities. And all of these are the western side of town, because these are the people who have to pay to send their sons, at that time were certainly sons, to school or to some type of painting academy. Rather nice hair bond down there, Brighton's cosmopolitan nature even then. This is another address up this way, down at Clarence Square, which of course Clarence Square is still there. The Ragland House, the education of young gentlemen, and there's got the terms and conditions running away down there. Schools were going up increasingly in poorer areas as being funded as charitable events. Now, under what is now Churchill Square was one of Brighton's 4 big, very poor areas. And Carlton Hill, over near the police station, was one. Pimlico, it's the southern end of North Lane. Second one, Durham and Petty France, which is a lovely name for a horrendous slum, which was the Clock Tower and Queen Square. And the fourth one was Kent's Court, which is right in the western side of West Street around St Paul's Church. St Paul's Church was called originally St Paul's in the Fishery, because it was a big fishing community. And when you talk about Brighton history, any fishing community is right at the bottom of the social spectrum. And so here you've got a rather nice image there from the James Gray collection at Regency Society. Huge, but it's still an enormous looking church today. And I think the school is the building just to the right there. I'll say the pointer won't work on these screens, but here's St Paul's Church. There's 2 schools here. That's the school at the end of Russell Place. So that goes when they build Churchill Square. And adjacent to it is the infant school, which is here, okay? And I think, again, it's that building on the left-hand side. And that's a wonderful, evocative image. You went through that archway, up some steps, and that kind of brought you up into Upper Russell Street. So it's that little gap just here is what we're looking at there. And I think the infant, though it's got the infant school on the right-hand side, I don't think that's correct. I think it's this building on the left-hand side behind the telegraph pole there. But that was an incredibly poor district, so these would have been funded through the church. And as always, with St Paul's Church, St Bart's, St Martin's, St John's up in Carlton Hill, the Wagner family, who were immensely wealthy and very, very, very high Anglicans, put their very, very grand churches in the poorest areas of town. So St Bart's goes in the railway yards, St Paul's in the Fishery down here, St John's, which is now Greek Orthodox, up above the Carlton Hill slum. So for the glory of God, you know, you're putting these in the poorest possible areas. There were other odd little bits of educational history around scholastic agency, Mathema House, Hampton Place, and again we're just off Western Road running up towards Upper North Street, conducted by Mrs Abel with Mr George Abel as the private tutor, and he'll allow us 11 till 6. Okay. And then right at the top of the hill, on the corner of St Michael's Place, just opposite the church, you've got West Combe House School for Young Ladies. And this is a lovely piece here. The higher education of women has now passed beyond the region of argument and has become a fait accompli. Yet the world has not experienced any of those untoward results which opponents of progress told us would follow if girls were given the advantages which for centuries have been enjoyed by their brothers. Yeah. And that building is still there. That's the building number 1 and 2, St Michael's Place, now beautifully painted bright white with some rather curious balconies added to it, but that's still West Combe House School for Young Ladies. Now, by 1895, we've already had 20 years of state education. It wasn't as long-lived as we have education today. Most people believe in school at 13 until they moved it up to 14 by the turn of the century. Okay. Now, so it's not really clear. There's Brighton High School, which is not the girls' school, for residential and day boys, 24 Powis Square, which is the building on the right-hand side there. Powis Square was lots of small schools. There was a girls' school on one corner, boys' school on the other, and some independent tutors further up. And it's a large playing field for physical exercise in Dyke Road. Don't exactly know where that was. Whether it was where we are up here, I don't know. But you see, sound modern education, French, German, short. Of course, in schools, you know, huge decline now in foreign language teaching in schools. Yeah. 1904, first thing they mention. Okay. If you stay in St Michael's Place, it's in that Clifton Hill, Montpelier area, right at the top left-hand corner of St Michael's Place was a blue plaque erected. Pete Stocker's doing something on blue plaques a few years ago. Mary Hare, suffragette and pioneer teacher of the deaf. 1895-1901. When they did the plaque, it was rather nice because she got her name on a bus. So they incongruously had a bus at the top of St Michael's Place. But she had also, in the First World War, set up a female police force. And a senior female police officer from Sussex and Stanbury was there as well. But she was a great character, Mary Hare, very much of her time as this suffragette, because she also opens a bit later the Oral School for the Deaf and Dumb. Miss Hare, 19 and 20 Goldsmith Road, so just around the corner, receives deaf and dumb or partially deaf children as boarders or day defective. So, you know, very, very advanced, and lip reading lessons given to adults. Very important if you've got private lessons given at above dress. And eventually it moves from there to Burgess Hill, and then from Burgess Hill to Reading, and the school is still in Reading, and I think it was the principal of the school in Reading came for the unveiling of that. So it's very, very advanced for its something. Because this is Brighton, we do advanced things. Okay. That moves later, the Institution for the Deaf and Dumb, established 1842. So I'm not certain where that had been established, whether it was in Brighton or doesn't say it was established in Brighton. But you've got, you know, the nice list of patrons there, subscriptions and donations. And I'll tell you, the next slide, I'm sorry, it's a bit hazy, because if I remember right, it was a bitterly cold day when I took this, and I couldn't stop my hand shaking. But this is up on Eastern Road, when the pluck went up about 10 years ago to new property, but that's where the school was, up towards Brighton College, that end of the town. Okay. Now, by the 1850s, you know, Brighton's grown substantially, forces its way up to Preston Circus. It couldn't cross Preston Circus because then you go into Preston Parish, which was owned by the Stanford family at Preston Manor, and they didn't sell land. That was it. So Brighton's bursting at the seams. So when you drive up on the one-way system going up from the fire station up towards Ditchling Road, on the right-hand side is 1830s houses, on the other side is 1870s houses, because that's only when they expanded across the border. But Brighton is bursting at the seams. But at that time, you've very definitely got a West End and an East End. Now, the East End changes at that time, because by the 1850s, Kemp Town, which had been built in the 1820s, which was a financial disaster. With all due respect to anyone living in Rottingdean, it was on the road to nowhere at the top of an inaccessible cliff, and no one was living near it. So only by the 1850s, Brighton had grown out to Kemp Town, and it gets to be, you know, the very swanky area which we associate with. But very definitely, this western side of town is, you know, the educational hub of the city. But by the time we get that expansion going eastwards, we've already got you know, Henry Ben Elliot here establishing St Mary's Hall, and 1836, and then just down the road, 10 years so after, 1845, it's a lovely period image here from the Herald, Brighton College, which I saw one of the top 100 schools in the world. Did you see that in the Argus? It's in the Argus, so it must be true. Okay. Now, quite famously, when you get to that end of town, we've got the start of Rodie, called the Wimbledon House School, because it originates in Wimbledon with the Lawrence sisters, who moved down to Brighton and established the school here in Lewis Crescent, and then much later it moves out to its present-day location. It's now become part of a bigger academy group, I think, the Rodine. But foundation stone, late 1890. It's a really long-distance lens view here from high up in Sussex County. Just while we're out that end of town, from the various street directories, you get an idea of this was the area where, certainly after the 1850s, when it had been absorbed into the town, you've got a series of Miss Dighton's School, the Reverend Percival Frost Boys' School, and Mrs. Langtry's Ladies' Boarding School, you know, virtually adjacent to one another in Sussex Square. And this won't be particularly clear, but this is the street directory for 1866. There are 17 schools in Sussex Square. So you've got the Reverend John Nelson Galty at number 2. This is the chap who was at the Meeting House Lane, the meeting house there. Then you've got a bit further down here, you've got the Mrs. Brewer Ladies' School, Mrs. Miller's Ladies' School, Miss Dighton's Ladies' School we saw, Reverend Frost Gentleman's School, and then Miss Creswell's School, and so on. The Mrs. Dodd here, the Miss Wilmhurst, William Dart, 17 schools in that one small area. And again, this is 1866, so this is all before the Education Act. So these are all, you know, the residents who are paying for their children to be educated here. So there's no state education at that time at all. Okay, slightly different. We're looking at a variety of different ways of educating, and the Diocesan Training School for School Mistresses, which is the building still there, the Brighton Business Centre up on the corner of Viaduct Road and Ditchling Road, but this was set up as training Sunday school teachers. And of course, teaching staff at that time were unmarried. Once you married, you were no longer part of the teaching team. But these were single ladies who were training up as Sunday school teachers, so Diocesan Training School. And that goes on until just before World War II, so that's there for a considerable time. And a rather nice image there, Reverend Gentleman and some of the teachers. Okay, girls by this time getting good education. We saw the one up in St Michael's Place. These are two nearby in Hove, Medina Villas and Tisbury Road, the Addiscombe College and the Ladies' College and Heidelberg House. Presumably changes its name in 1914. You know, what we now call Madeira Place up St James's Street was German Place, but it was spelt German, as in Jermyn Street in London. But as this was Brighton, everyone just called it German, and so they changed the name to Madeira, which Portugal was neutral. So the name changes there. But I've been doing a lot of work recently with the 1914 street directories for Brighton. Huge number of people in Brighton had Germanic names, whether they're Jewish Germanic or just Central European Germanic. Abrupt change of them against the 1920s. That a lot of the names have been completely anglicised, you know. We've always been a very cosmopolitan community. A lot of the German families were associated with the hotels because a lot of them were musicians in the hotels. You know, there were kind of national traits for occupations, And if you went for a job as a musician, you had to have a Germanic sounding name. You know, Cockney rhyming slang for hands, Germans, German bands. You know, so you know, most of these would have been probably Jewish people from Central Europe, but there was a big German community in the city. And then a grammar school at last, Preston Grammar School down Millers Road. So not a million miles away from us here, going down Millers Road, that very steep slope by the railway yards. Mr. and Mrs. Parvin, headmistress, and Mr. Special attention to backward and delicate children. You know. And then Miss Madam Murray Clawell, Professor of Singing, afternoon evening parties, and Mr. Gravitt, Sandhurst Woolwich Military Academy. Mr. JJ prepares individuals and expeditiously for the above. So if you want to get sent off to Sandhurst or Woolwich, you go to Mr. Gravitt's school. There were niche markets. Brighton always very artistic, theatrical community. So we've got a whole series of Brighton School of Music starts out in North Street, goes into Marlborough Place, and then moves out to opposite St Peter's Church here in St Peter's Place. So Brighton School of Music and Drama. And the wonderful Miss May Mallam visits and receives pupils for piano. It would have to be piano, wouldn't it? And singing lessons. And then there's the School of Music and Drama. It's probably very much associated with here. Okay, and there's a wonderful set of ladies here, the Miss Fuggles. Now the Miss Fuggles go on forever. They lived at 9 Powis Villas, which is this house here, this one, and they had another class round on the corner of Clifton Terrace. And from just after the First World War, you've got the 3 Miss Fuggles running this school. And eventually they split it into 2 sections. And not a lot was known about them, but the My Brighton and Hove History website, which is one of the I helped set up in 1993, whole series of letters about the Miss Fuggles and people reminiscing about them. And you follow it through the directories until you get to the 1950s when there's a Miss Fuggle. You know, so the others are at the great blackboard in the sky, obviously, you know. But lots of very fond reminiscences of the wonderfully named the Miss Fuggles. Okay, now, this is an important person in Brighton. At the face of it, not to really to do with education, but Thomas Simpson, architect and surveyor. Successors to the business for many years carried on Mr. James Charnock Simpson, and established 1825, and we're down here in 16 Ship Street, Brighton. Plans, specifications, estimate every class of building, ecclesiastical and civil. And what the Simpsons go on to be are the school builders for Brighton. So here you've got, I used to be on the Brighton Council Blue Plaques Committee, you know, before Pete Crowhurst. And Thomas Simpson here, architect and surveyor of Brighton, who Connaught Road schools here, wonderful, evocative look to it. Once you see one Simpson school, you've seen every Simpson school. So there's Connaught, and that's one of the last Blue Plaques meetings. I fell out with the chairman of the Blue Plaques Committee and was ignominiously thrown off. But I was there for the unveiling. Okay, and then Park Street here. My mum went to Park Street. She lived at 145 Edward Street and went to Park Street School there. And my old school, Stamford Road County Primary, yes! Well, there's people waving from the top there, wonderful. So it hasn't changed enormously at all. I lived in Dyke Road Drive, just a little bit further down the slope from there. My brother was there during the Second World War. I went there in the 50s and before coming here. Okay, so the specialist schools, by the 30s, we've got a very poor area, Sussex Street, up over the Carlton Hill slums area, is being cleared, and we're getting the new blocks of flats being built up there, which everybody in Brighton calls Kingswood and Milner Flats. Correctly, Milner Flats, Kingswood's on Maisonettes, which gets my goat when people call them both flats. But this is the Margaret Macmillan open-air nursery school in what would have been incredibly poor and deprived area, but part of that new rebuilding of the area, what's now the Circus Street area. Okay, and then post-war, Big expansion. I currently live up in Hollingbury, and that was the small holdings area. They decided to move new factory estate up to Crowhurst Road from 1946 onwards, and the workforce would live nearby. So the Hollingbury Council Estate, as it then was, is built for that. And the first school built after World War II in Brighton was Carden School. And I do have to say, it's wonderful. It still looks like that today. There's a bit of colourful painting on the exterior, but the buildings are absolutely classic early 1950s buildings. And then the university. Now, everyone thinks, Sussex University, 1961. It's incipient there from 1913, University College for Sussex. Progress should have been made for the scheme for establishing at Brighton a university for Sussex. And then that goes into abeyance because the First World War, and then it's the Wall Street crash, and then it's the Second World War. But 1948, Education, University of Sussex Plan, okay? And in 1957, thousands here of university. The case for building of the University of Sussex at Brighton was put before hundreds of thousands of listeners. There we are, so detention for that boy. Okay. So here's the site. You've got Falmer Station at the bottom. The little building here, Knight's Gate, is still there. And those of you who know the University of Sussex campus, that section of buildings there is now the Meeting House multi-denominational chapel, which is there, and that's the site of the university, midway between the historic centre of Lewes and the cultural and the nightlife centre of Brighton. And Basil Spence said you couldn't offer an architect a better scheme than between Brighton and Lewes, set in the middle of the South Downs. You see, every architect's absolute dream. Okay, so this gets built. These are the Grade 1 buildings, either loved or not loved, but they're there and expanded greatly. And then the Brighton Teacher Training College, which becomes the College of Technology and then becomes Brighton University across the road from Sussex. Okay. College of Art, there for a long time down on Grand Parade, gets rebuilt mostly from 1958, lovely curved frontage by Percy Billington, who is the city architect. Now, we're on Grand Parade, so this was mentioned earlier on, Lancaster House. 47 Grand Parade by Charles Barry, who goes on to do wonderful things, including St Peter's Church, proprietary grammar and commercial school for the sons of tradesmen. Okay? And Reverend John Griffiths, formerly of Brighton College, with a Protestant bias. It says, might be Brighton, but we like to know, keep it straight. Okay, so there we are. Then 80 Buckingham Road, in May 1868, Brighton Grammar School Limited, and then acquired 12 Buckingham Road for the lower school. Later becomes the maternity nurses' home. Transfers to a trust in 1906, 1910, failed to prosper financially. In liquidation. See me in my study, boy. So there we are. We're down here, the Brighton Grammar School, right on the corner there. The building was, for years and years and years, had been a completely derelict site. Believe they're working on it now. There it was, rather grim-looking building, but of its period. And here we are, 1896, collection of boys outside. It was a traditional school photo. What if anyone's running from one end to the other to get in the picture twice? And then, there we are, look, they acquired the lambing field in Tongdene Lane in 1912, surprisingly after they'd gone bust. But 15 acres purchased in 1902, where sports was sold in 1917. I'm trying to find out exactly where the lambing field is. It's probably part of Wigdean Stadium now. I can imagine that's what it must be. But a wonderful school sports day. You can see the railway line and the railway arch further down. So it's in that same area. Okay, and then the Brighton Grammar School Cadets. Those who remember, this is Friday afternoon in the CCF, okay, June the 13th, 1912. They've got wooden rifles there by the look of it. But yeah, rather sad because how many of these boys then go off to war 2 years later. And then it's the foundation, so they were going to march up to Dyke Road here for the foundation stone laying. Wonderful set of scaffolding there. And then, sadly, within a year of it opening in 1930, it's one of the many venues in Brighton which were military hospitals. Okay, and of course that's where, you know, that's the building, wonderfully, completely unmucked about with. But it's a product of its time, looking very grand, looking like a grammar school. And so look, I'll give you a rough rundown across the history of the city, aspects of education, and I know old boys are here. I'm always proud to say I'm an old grammarian. Thank you very much.